Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Sometimes I make a video because something comes to my attention independently, and I think it's worthwhile breaking it down to the player base. Other times though, someone else does the research, and then reaches out to me and says, hey, you've got a bit more reach than I do, why don't you talk to people about this interaction? This is that latter type of video. I was reached out to by one of the people who runs the PathOfExile wiki, and they've been doing some extensive research into some corner case interactions in the Bloodnotch Immutable Force setup that a lot of players use to make their character very tanky. Now, a quick recap on how this works. Bloodnotch is a jewel that rewards you for suffering stuns on your character, and it rewards you with a considerable amount of life recovery. If you take a 3000 damage hit and that hit actually succeeds in stunning your character, then a perfectly rolled Bloodnotch is going to refund 1800 of that life on the very next frame. This is not something that makes you completely immortal, but it is definitely something that can make you very tanky, especially if it's used in conjunction with life recoup effects, and also in conjunction with Progenesis, Petrified Blood, and other similar mechanics. This can make a character extremely difficult to kill. However, the consequence of this is of course that you are being stunned. Stuns by default last for 350 milliseconds, and that's where Immutable Force comes in. Immutable Force is a jewel that was added in patch 3.20, and it provides you with an enormous amount of resilience against stun, but the stuns still happen. The stuns still happen just as easily as they would if you weren't using Immutable Force. What this does is it gives you a between 500 and 1000% bonus to how quickly your character recovers from stuns. It also does the same thing for block, but for this video it's the stun component that matters. Now, if you're using Immutable Force on your character, there is only one breakpoint that matters, and that is 961%. If between all the sources of stun recovery on your character, which in some cases might even just be Immutable Force, if you can get this number up to 961%, then that 350 millisecond stun is going to be dropped down to only lasting one frame. But if you can't get to 961 of this stat, but you can get to 431, then 431 to 960%, this is going to nerf stuns that land on your character to be only 2 frames in length. Fundamentally, Bloodnotch makes you extremely tanky, but has an overwhelmingly serious drawback. Immutable Force almost completely neutralizes that drawback for you. That is the defensive package involving these two items. Immutable Force plus Bloodnotch feels really strong until it suddenly stops working. And all of this new research is based upon those moments that it stops working. So, it's important to note that this is based upon the way the game works on the 7th of January 2024. This is the sort of thing that feels to me like there's a bug involved, and so it feels like something that might get patched. If you're watching this video meaningfully after that date, then I would check the wiki page, which I'll put a link to down in the description below, because down the bottom in the version history section, there'll be a whole bunch of information about this. So the way that people thought this worked previously was that any damage that your character suffered that simultaneously would freeze and stun you would only freeze you instead. That has turned out not to be correct, although it's a reasonably good starting point for understanding how this works. There's a number of corner cases though that theory will get wrong. So assuming that a hit is large enough to stun you, and on builds that are using the Bloodnotch Immutable Force tech, then chances are you've set that up so that it is a very low number. There are 3 conditions that, if they're all simultaneously met, will prevent a hit from stunning you, and therefore will prevent Bloodnotch from recovering you a whole bunch of life. All 3 of these conditions need to be met. The first one is that the hit needs to be a critical strike. The second one is that the defender needs to actually suffer cold damage. Now this can be as a result of direct cold damage, for example a monster using Ice Nova on you. It can be monster physical damage that has been converted into cold, for example a monster casting Glacial Cascade on you, or it can be a monster that is directly doing physical damage to you, but because of effects like the Taste of Hate unique flask, you're instead suffering some or all of that damage as cold damage. The third condition that needs to be met is something that is met by default, and that is that the attacker's critical strikes have the capacity to freeze. This has not been stripped away from that monster or from that skill by the use of an item like Leadership's Price, or Gale Sight, or the Cluster Jewel exclusive Secrets of Suffering. What's interesting is that it doesn't matter whether the player that's using the Bloodnotch Immutable Force setup is immune to freeze or not. For example, a player that is using the aura Purity of Elements will be outright immune to freeze as well as to all other elemental ailments. But that is not going to change the behaviour of an enemy's Glacial Cascade that hits you. If that Glacial Cascade critically strikes you, then it is not going to inflict a stun unless that monster has been modified by something like Secrets of Suffering, And in that situation, Bloodnotch is not going to trigger because you haven't been stunned, you're not going to have this life recovery, and it can result in you falling over and dying. A couple of really interesting corner cases that were tested here. What happens if it is Hex Blast, which is a skill that deals chaos damage but has the capacity to freeze? And here it's important that Hex Blast has no added cold damage on it at all. In this situation, it doesn't matter whether Hex Blast critically strikes or not, because the second condition isn't met. As a result, the skill is capable of inflicting a stun. So strategically, what are the solutions that you can use here? Well, if you're not playing in hardcore, it's probably sufficient to select a stun mastery and go with hits against you cannot be critical strikes if you have suffered a stun recently. This is probably going to be the case almost all the time on a Bloodnotch Immutable Force build, and as a result of them not being critical strikes, condition 1 isn't met, so it doesn't matter even if the monster has some capacity to inflict freezes on non-critical strikes. Bloodnotch will jump in to provide you with that life recovery. The other option that's particularly good, and this is not the only other option, there's a couple more of them that are listed on the PoE wiki, link again down below, is if you're using Mohoxidal's Machination in conjunction with a Tempered by War keystone, which is something you can only get through a timeless duel. Anyways, I thought this was some really interesting research that when I was asked to bring it to the attention of the wider PoE community, I thought was definitely worth my while doing. Hopefully if all the corner case technicalities in this video were a little bit too much for you, you recover from the stun quickly.